to part two of the war in Europe. So, Adolf Hitler in 1923 was imprisoned in Landsberg prison for attempting to overthrow the German government in what came to be known as the Beer Hall Putsch. A putsch is the German word for a coup d'etat, which is when you attempt to overthrow the government. So while Hitler was incarcerated, he was also in prison with some of his Nazi cronies, including his second in command, Rudolf Hess. And Hess assisted him in writing his book, which was called Mein Kampf. In German, it literally means my struggle. And in Mein Kampf, Hitler laid out his worldview. He wanted to obtain what was called Lebensraum, which literally in German means living space. Hitler had this idea that the German people did not have enough land to occupy, and he theorized that by invading the East, particularly Russia, that the German people could then move to Russia and there establish a perfect Germanic society, and for lack of a better term, killing and enslaving the Slavic people who already lived there. So on June 22nd, 1941, Hitler made good on his idea and invaded Russia. So there's a lot there's a lot of moving parts that go into Hitler's invasion of Russia. So on August 23rd, 1939, we're rewinding a little bit. The Germans and the Soviets, remember the Soviet Union is Russia, they signed a non-aggression pact called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Molotov was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, and Joachim von Ribbentrop was the foreign minister for the German government. So they said, you know what, we're not going to go to war with each other. And this was shocking because fascism, which is what Hitler was, he was a Nazi, and communism are polar opposites, two completely opposite ideas, opposite ends of the spectrum. And Hitler regarded the Bolsheviks as being which are the communists, as being one of his biggest enemies. So Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, plunging Europe into the Second World War. On September 17th, 1939, the Soviets invaded Poland from the east. So Poland was fighting the Germans in the west and the Soviets in the east. And Poland was no match for either army and completely collapsed about 3 weeks later, or by the beginning of October. So the two countries divided up Poland between themselves. And during the summer of 1940, after the very quick and crushing defeat of France, the Germans launched what was called the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe, their air force, their commander was Hermann Goering. And Goering assured Adolf Hitler that he could bomb the British into submission. Now, the problem with this was, and it's not going to mention this in your book, the problem with this plan was the Germans did not have a heavy bomber. Their bombers were built for assisting infantry and tanks. They carried a light load. They were built for what's called blitzkrieg. And the Messerschmitt 109, the German fighter escort aircraft, and the bombers could not carry enough fuel to stay over Britain for an extended period of time. And the Germans had almost brought the British to their knees when a German bomb crew got lost and accidentally dropped some bombs on London. At this point in the war, cities were not targeted. So an enraged Churchill sent a bomber crew to bomb Berlin. And so the Nazis began heavy bombing London and other large cities. And when they did this, they took their resources away from bombing military targets towards bombing civilian targets that had no military value. And this allowed the Royal Air Force to recover and ultimately win the Battle of Britain and defeat the Luftwaffe. So Hitler was frustrated. He never got to launch his land attack of Britain, and he couldn't bomb them and bring them out, knock them out of the war by bombing them. So he said, you know what? This was Hitler's view. He viewed that the British were racially similar to the Germans, which meant he really didn't have a lot of animosity towards them. So he turned his attention towards the Soviet Union and the Russians and the Slavic people that lived there, whom he hated. So the Germans unleashed Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941. It was the largest invasion in the history of the world at this point. So Joseph Stalin was the dictator of the Soviet Union, and he made a big mistake. He was paranoid about political enemies, and he purged the Soviet military, which was called the Red Army, of its leadership, which left only junior and incompetent officers in charge. And when the Germans invaded them, they totally surprised Stalin, and the German army advanced really, really swiftly. And the Soviet army began retreating and practicing a scorched earth policy, which means burning anything that an invading army can use. If you remember world history, this is the same thing the Russians did to Napoleon's army about 130 years before this. So the Germans would eventually surround Leningrad, which is called St. Petersburg today. The Germans had a three-pronged attack. They had Army Group North, which targeted Leningrad, and they had Army Group Center, which targeted Moscow, and Army Group South, which targeted the oil-rich Caucasus region. And Army Group Center made it almost to the gates of Moscow before the winter set in and stalled their advance. So the German three-pronged advance was stopped by the Russian winter, not so much the Russian army. And this would come into play. The German military was not equipped to handle the ferocious Russian winter. So at this point, Stalin asked the Americans for help through the Lend-Lease program. This was the same program where we leased and gave military equipment to the British, with some attachments, of course, to use to try to repel the Germans. So the Americans began sending supplies to the Soviets, although we weren't formally in the war yet. We would enter the war in December 1941 with the Japanese invasion. So Stalin, realizing he was bearing the brunt of the fighting, the Western Allies were fighting the Germans in North Africa. He wanted the British and the Americans to attack in Northern Europe to force the Germans to move some of their soldiers from the east to the west to take some pressure off of his armies. But Churchill convinced Roosevelt. He said, Roosevelt, we're not really ready to take on the heart of the German army head on. Let's invade Italy. They're the junior partner in the Axis alliance. He called them the soft underbelly of Europe. So the Americans and British began their invasion of Sicily and quickly knocked the Italians out of the war. Now, meanwhile, Hitler, for symbolic reasons, really wanted to attack a city called Stalingrad on the Volga River, which today is called Volgograd. And because it was named for Stalin, not so much because of its military value. But the Germans threw all of these resources into attacking Stalingrad. Now, your book doesn't mention it, but at this point, Stalin had received intelligence that the other Axis partner, Japan, in the Far East, had no intention of invading the Soviets from the east. So he was able to move these resources to the west and these extra soldiers and launch a counterattack, and was eventually able to encircle the Germans around the city of Stalingrad. And by the end of January, the Germans were completely surrounded. Hitler actually promoted the general there, a man named Friedrich von Paulus. He promoted him to field marshal to try to imply that Paulus was supposed to kill himself. But Paulus did not. He surrendered with the rest of his army. And Paulus allowed himself to be used for Soviet propaganda after his capture. He's really upset of Adolf Hitler, because Hitler had ordered the army to stay in place rather than break out when they could. So they were almost all either killed or captured, and most of them that were captured died in captivity. Very few members of the German army at Stalingrad actually saw Germany again. So Germany lost about 330,000 soldiers that they could not replace at Stalingrad. The Soviet Union's losses are unknown, but some estimates are as high as over 1 million soldiers were lost on the Soviet end. So from this point on, the Germans were on the defensive. They would, the following summer, launch one more offensive in the east called the Battle of Kursk, which until Operation Desert Storm was the largest tank battle in world history. They would ultimately lose Kursk, and they would be caught on both sides between the Soviets in the east and the Western Allies, which would gradually squeeze them inwards. So in the meantime, the Americans and the British were dominating the air war, and the British had developed a strategy called carpet bombing, where they would launch huge numbers of aircraft to attack not only German industrial facilities, but also factories to try to ruin Germany's war-making capabilities. They would also purposely light cities on fire by firebombing them. I've been to Germany, and if you go to their cities, there aren't many of the old buildings left. They're almost all new because they got leveled during World War II. So the bombing went on round the clock. The British Lancaster bombers bombed Germany at night, while the British the British Lancasters bombed Germany at night, while the American B-17s bombed flying fortresses, bombed the Germans during the day. So it's round the clock bombing at this point. So the Allies would eventually invade Germany December 6th, 1944, through the D-Day invasion. And the army that carried out most of the advances was Patton's Third Army, and they advanced steadily towards Normandy. From Normandy towards Berlin. Now, the Allies had tricked the Germans. The Germans actually believed that the battle would come at a place called Pont du Calais, because it's the closest distance between Germany and the United Kingdom. But the Allies tricked Hitler and invaded in Normandy. Now, Hitler, believing that the battle would take place at Pont du Calais, ordered some tanks that could have repelled the invasion to stay put in Calais, and this allowed the Americans to establish a beachhead. Now, at this point, the Third Army, under the command of George Patton, began advancing steadily towards Berlin. And slowly but surely, French, Belgian, and Dutch cities were liberated from German occupation. But as they got nearer Germany, the resistance stiffened, and Hitler would throw everything he had left in the Battle of the Bulge. Yes, there's a movie made about it. So the German army advanced under the cover of some really bad weather, which made up for the fact that they didn't have a lot of air power. They tried to capture American fuel, and their ultimate goal was to capture the port of Antwerp to try to cut off the supplies that were given to the soldiers on the continent. So eventually the German army was defeated, and they were pushed steadily back towards Germany at this point. So at this point, the Third Reich, which is what Hitler called his government, was really, really in a lot of trouble. So Hitler being squeezed from both sides, the two armies, the American and the Soviet armies, met at the Elbe River in eastern Germany. The Soviets completely surrounded Berlin, and on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life along with his wife, who had just married the day before, Eva Braun. Hitler took a cyanide capsule and shot himself in the head with a gun called a Walther PPK, and Eva Braun ate a cyanide capsule, and they ordered their bodies to be burned. They were only partially burned, and they were discovered by the Red Army. So Hitler was replaced by a man named Admiral Dönitz, and Dönitz formally took Germany out of the war May 8th, 1945. So the Allies had earlier decided on a post-war plan for Germany. They divided Germany up, with the Western Allies dividing up Western Germany and the Soviets taking the eastern portion. Berlin would also be divided up, with the Western Allies taking West Berlin and the Soviets keeping East Berlin. Now, Stalin promised he would give Eastern Europe free elections, which he did not. He established what was called the Soviet Bloc, or the Warsaw Pact nations, which were the communist nations during the Cold War. and Eastern Germany would become the country of East Germany, and Germany would stay divided until 1991, when it was ultimately allowed to reunify after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So Stalin did not keep his promise. These free elections never happened. There is one promise he did keep, but not till the very end. So Germany was knocked out of the war, but Japan was still alive. They were still in it. They had retreated back to their home islands. They only really occupied a section of China called Manchuria, which is in the northeast, and Korea. So the Americans dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, a nuclear bomb, August 6, 1945. The Japanese did not believe in surrender. They kept fighting. A few days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. That same day, the Soviets made good on their promise and invaded the region of China called Manchuria. And Japan would finally surrender. All right, so I hope you guys found this lesson helpful. Have a wonderful day.